All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to PPAN's August webinar titled Parks, Pollinators, and People. Do bees and butterflies prefer higher income parks in Denver? We've got Nicki Bailey from Colorado State University with us today, along with Jessica Andersen and Brandon Herman from Denver Parks and Recreation. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for People and Pollinators Action Network, or as we like to call it, PPAN. For those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we try to hold one each month with a different speaker. So be sure to sign up for our e-news and check out our events calendar to keep up to date with the upcoming webinars. We've really got a great presentation prepared for you, but first we just wanted to tell you a little bit about us. So we're People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN, the host of this webinar. We really focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. We do this a lot through grassroots advocacy, education, and outreach, kind of like this webinar. We also do a lot of policy, community mobilization and habitat creation. A good example of this would be our Habitat Fund, which is based off the sales of the pollinator license plate. And this fund goes towards creating pollinator safe spaces while promoting community mobilization. I also wanted to take this opportunity to share about our Bumblebee Bash. So we'll be having our 8th annual Bumblebee Bash on September 7th at Yellow Barn Farm in Longmont. This is really our most important community building and fundraising event of the year. And it's really a chance for us to celebrate together the many victories for pollinators and the victories for the people who love them that PPAN and all of our incredible partners have fought for and won over the past decade since our founding. I can put a link in the chat where you can learn more and purchase tickets, and we'd really love to see you there. So we're really grateful to have Nicki Bailey with us today from CSU. Nicki is a master's student in ecology at Colorado State University, working with Dr. John Mola. Her passion for pollinators began during her undergraduate studies at Kalamazoo College, studying bumblebees with Dr. Ann Fraser, and it's only grown over the last 5 years. Her master's thesis that we're going to talk about today investigates the impact of landscape features, neighborhood income, and honeybee abundance on native bee and butterfly biodiversity in Denver parks. Notably, her research identified 36 first-time bee species records in Denver and also informed the development of more holistic management practices and recommendations for Denver parks, really bridging the gap between urban social structures and plant-insect interactions. After graduation, Nicki plans to continue researching urban pollinators and engaging in outreach activities to improve the public understanding of native bee conservation. She will begin a PhD with Dr. John Mola in the fall of 2025. And in her free time, she enjoys drawing, live music, and reading outdoors with a sparkling water in hand. And once Nicki is finished with her presentation, we're excited to have Jessica Andersen and Brandon Herman from Denver Parks and Rec to chat with us about what this study means for the future of Denver parks. So Jessica has centered her career on connecting people with nature through the built environment. And as the urban ecology supervisor with Denver Parks and Rec, she advocates for urban public spaces that benefits humans and the trees, bees, and ecosystem services that keep Denver a livable city. Brandon is a dedicated urban biodiversity and ecology practitioner guided by research, data, and the art of science storytelling. He is trained as a landscape architect and conservation planner. So he occupies an increasingly critical niche that seeks to connect contemporary science to the plans, policies, and projects that shape our urban landscapes. And as the senior urban ecology planner with Denver Parks and Recreation, He leads efforts to ensure the park system and open spaces are equitable, resilient to climate change, and successfully support nature and native biodiversity. So throughout this webinar, we really want to emphasize how parks relate to people and pollinators. Parks are really more than just green spaces in our cities. They're vital hubs for biodiversity. These areas provide essential habitats for urban pollinators, and by supporting pollinators, parks also enhance our own quality of life. They connect us to nature and ensure that our communities remain vibrant and sustainable. I can kind of throw an example of this in the chat of a video that we did with Denver Parks and Rec's Skylar Smith. And then finally, before we get started, please stay muted. Leave your questions in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. And we also want to encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series. And these donations will support PPAN's education, advocacy, and habitat creation efforts this spring. A donation of any size really does make a difference, so thank you for your consideration. And I can put a link in the chat for that as well to make it easy for people. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Nicki. Again, thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Anna Gray. Well, let's get it. I'm so excited to have you all here. I'm writing my thesis right now, so this is nice to see other people's faces and to share this out loud because that's just been a lot of me in the computer. So I'm super excited to share this with you all. As Anna Gray mentioned, my name is Nicki Bailey. I'm from Colorado State University. And the title of my presentation today is Parks, Pollinators, and People, Do Bees and Butterflies Prefer Higher Income Parks in Denver? So kind of outlining our goals for today, we want to start out by just exploring who our pollinators are. I think we have a lot of pollinator experts and enthusiasts here, but I want to make sure we all have the same footing to start. And next, we want to understand urbanization and other potential causes for pollinator declines. Then we're going to analyze how urban parks actually support pollinators in Denver. And then I'm going to help contextualize those findings and help you understand what that means for you in your life and in our Denver parks. So beginning with who are our pollinators, I think these are familiar individuals for you all. Butterflies and bees are kind of our go-to poster children pollinators, but you also probably know that there's lots of pollinators beyond them. So we have different Lepidoptera, like our clearwing moth here, and other moth species. We have hummingbirds and other songbirds have also been tied to pollination. Wasps, I know they bother us, but they're also really helpful for pollination with some species. And then we have hoverflies, beetles, and many, many more. But for our purposes today, we're going to focus on bees and butterflies, and this is kind of going to set the tone for hopefully future research where we can expand to other species as well. Now, starting with butterflies. So all of us have seen beautiful butterflies. They're charismatic insects that a lot of people can really relate to. And we actually have around 250 butterfly species native to Colorado alone. So we're lucky to have a ton of diversity of butterflies. Most of these photos were even taken right in Denver. So we have great diversity in our backyard. And then here we have bees. So many of you know there are many different kinds of bees, but you might not know that there's almost or over 1,000 described species, probably more in Colorado alone. And they have all different shapes, colors, sizes, and occupy different niches. But unlike honeybees, which I think a lot of us know a lot about, most of these bees are actually solitary, which means that they nest by themselves, often underground or in cavities, and they don't have huge colonies that they're relying on. We do have some species who are social, like bumblebees still have small colonies with 30 to 40 or 50 individuals, but for the most part, these guys are by themselves and living a pretty rugged life. Here are some examples of what nesting looks like for those different bee species. So on the top left, you see those cavities. Those are kind of like open reeds or stems. And bees will actually go into those stems, hollow them out, and then lay their progeny there. So those will eventually emerge next spring, but they're never actually raising their young. And then on the right, you see a little bee emerging out of the ground. Over 70% of our bee species are actually ground nesting. So this will always just look like a little hole in the soil. You might not even notice it, but that actually could be a bee nest. So it's really important to have those bare patches of loose soil so that they're able to burrow down and make their nests. And then in the bottom, this is a little bit difficult to see, but that's kind of par for the course because bumblebee nests are really difficult to see and difficult to find. But this is actually a bumblebee colony. It's underground and has been dug up in this photo, or I think it's a video, but we won't zoom in too far on it. But you can see that bumblebees actually do create some sort of broods and they are raising their young within that colony. So it's more similar to what you'd think of with honeybees, where they're creating those little cups that you see, and they're actually raising their young, but it's a lot smaller than what you'd think of for a honeybee. And now, what about honeybees? We've kind of introduced all the other bees. Lots of us know about honeybees already. They're actually not native to the US, so they are not the focus of presentation, but they're a really important part of our ecosystem still, because obviously we brought them here. And the reason that we care about them for this study is that they actually could be a threat to our native bee species, but more on that later. Now, why are pollinators important? I think a lot of us know about this economic importance component. We know that bees are really important for agriculture, for growing things like blueberries or peppers, especially honeybees and bumblebees. But there's also lots of other components that make them important to our ecosystem, like ecological importance. All of us have been through fourth or fifth grade science where you learn about food webs and food pyramids. Well, it turns out that butterflies are actually a really important food source for birds. So their larvae, the caterpillars, that's what helps birds grow up and grow strong. So even if butterflies, I will admit, are not that good of pollinators because they're not that fuzzy, they don't carry that much pollen, they're really important for other components of the ecosystem as well. And then, as we know, pollinators are the ones doing the heavy lifting to help our native plants be able to survive and reproduce. The plants have really trained the pollinators in a way to be able to carry their pollen and cross their genetic information so that they're able to survive, reproduce, and adapt too. So importance for our birds, our plants, and lots of other components to that food web. And then finally, narrowing more in on the focus today, pollinators are really important for human well-being in our cities and urban environments. We've created green spaces in urban areas like parks or urban gardens, and pollinators are really the ones doing the heavy lifting to be able to pollinate the plants there or to help us grow food in urban areas. And they all contribute to our overall happiness. If you through a park and you see a butterfly, you might have a better walk in that park because you saw a butterfly. At least that happens for me, but I'm a little bit biased. And again, I think a lot of us know pollinators are declining. Now, this graphic has a lot of information, but the main thing I want us to take away is that insects generally are declining, but we're seeing declines in pollinators specifically too, like bumblebees particularly, butterflies as well. And then focusing on this bottom half, mason bees and leafcutter bees, those are really big groups that actually involve a lot of different species. And so one of the big motivations for this study was looking at individuals like mason bees and leafcutter bees and all the species there, and actually doing a baseline understanding of who do we have in Denver, because we can't really protect anything or measure their declines if we don't know who's there to begin with. So this is a big motivation for us. And some of the big causes for these declines, I think probably several of you went to the webinar that the Colorado Native Pollinating Insects Health Study team did a couple months ago, which was awesome. And they put out this graphic in their new report, which I think is super helpful for understanding just what researchers think are the most important factors that are leading to pollinator declines. Obviously, climate change is a big one that we all know about, but I wanted to point out here the ones that I focused on for the motivation for my study. And as we can see, urbanization is right up there with one of the most important impacts that researchers think is causing these pollinator declines. Again, with managed pollinators like maybe honeybee competition, and then having plants that may not be native or be supporting pollinators in the right ecosystem. So delving a little bit more into urbanization, I think we kind of have an idea of what urbanization means. You can imagine it from a human perspective, but imagine it from an insect perspective. So if you think of your very favorite natural area, maybe it's up in the mountains, and you're looking there, you'll see there's a lot of diverse native flowers, there's native trees, grasses, there's host plants, which are a lot of those grasses and trees that could be for butterflies. You'll see a lot of bare ground because there's no built environment there. And then you'll see lots of those reeds and stems and kind of debris that's left over for overwintering, like we saw with the nesting photo for cavity nesting bees. But then if you think of urban environments, obviously we've created our own green space within them, which is super helpful, but that does create kind of a limit on what they're able to support. So we end up just having pockets of native flowers, gardens or lawns. And then we have a lot of non-native trees that are planted by the cities often, and turf grasses. That means that we're limiting a lot of butterfly host plants because we don't have native trees and grasses as much in cities. And we have a lot of impervious surface cover, like parking lots or driveways. And then finally, we're not left with a whole lot of wiggle room. I know as a renter myself, we were told to mow our lawns and take away all of the leaves at the end of the fall. And when we do that, we're actually eliminating some important habitat for bee nesting and overwintering. So what that looks like for our bee and butterfly communities is in more natural areas, we might have small populations of a lot of different species. Everyone's kind of able to find their own niche and get a piece of the pie. But as you go into an urban area, if you can imagine something like a raccoon, it just does really well in cities. So it's able to have a really big population. And we think that a lot of these insects might have been going through the same thing. The ones who can adapt and survive in this more difficult environment, they end up having really big populations, like your honeybees or like painted ladies even, who are really mobile. But then if you're not able to adapt as quickly, then you end up losing out. So we reduce our diversity and then we have a high abundance of fewer species. All right, so that's kind of our main background today. And now I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about our methods and our results. So we know pollinators are important. We know that cities could be causing their declines or be a part of the puzzle. And the other main motivation for doing this work in Denver specifically is the idea of the luxury effect. Now, the luxury effect is the idea that areas of high income also have high biodiversity. And this has been demonstrated in a lot of mammals and other insects, but not really in pollinators. And what this looks like for us is we have some parks like Rood Park, which is a lower income area. And then we have parks like Central Park that are surrounded by a higher neighborhood income. And you can see from the management of the park, huge differences. But within this study, we're not only looking at the park, but the surrounding area. So Rood Park is surrounded by a lot of buildings, a lot of commercial buildings, highway, whereas Central Park is surrounded by a lot of townhouses that might have lawns, they might have their own gardens. So you can see we're looking within the park, but I'll explain more in the methods that we're also including that surrounding area so that we can understand how income might be shaping and affecting these parks. Now, it's important to note that this is an extreme example of two different parks at two drastically different incomes, but most of our parks looked like this, where it was just grass, lawn grass, and maybe one little patch of flowers, but for the most part, they were grasses, usually not native, but we didn't have huge disparities among most of our parks. And the final thing that we want to discuss before we get into our methods is that in cities, it's important to think about conservation and also who we're trying to save and what bees we really want to support. A lot of really well-intentioned people in cities all across the US and even the world in the recent past have decided to put in backyard honeybee hives. And that's really great for education. It's great if you have a great lawn where you have plenty of resources, but people are a little bit misguided in the fact that they think then they're saving the bees, but really you're bringing in non-native that could be out competing your native pollinators. So we wanted to focus also on the honeybee abundance that we found in each of these parks to see if there's some kind of competition happening. Because in Denver right now, there's no restrictions or permits on owning hives. And so really we just want to understand what's there and if we're seeing any competition at this point. And this is part of what I'll research for my PhD, but up in the mountains. So more details to come in the next several years. All right, so our main research question here is to put it all together. We want to understand how socioeconomic, landscape, and local factors pollinator abundance and diversity in our Denver, Colorado parks. Now, we gathered a whole bunch of data for this study, but for the most part, we wanted to focus on the socioeconomic, landscape, and then a local factor. And of all of these things that we found, we focused on these few predictor variables. So socioeconomic status encompasses a huge amount of information about people, and we wanted to just focus more on the luxury effect, which relates to income. So we stuck to income. We picked a few landscape variables that really relate to urbanization specifically. And then we have our local factors, which is stuff that I actually measured in the field with my team, like floral abundance, floral species, and then honeybee abundance. Now on to our methods. So for our field sampling, this may look familiar to a lot of you. This is a map of Denver. The yellow represents different census tracts and the green are our study sites. So we had 25 parks all across the city that we visited 3 times each. And we chose a representative sample, 100-meter transect, we call it, to be able to walk and represent basically the best pollinator resources that were there at the time. And then we measured our floral relative abundance as well, which I'll talk more about. Now, selecting these sites was actually in partnership with Denver Parks and Rec. Each one of these sites was assigned a number 1 through 5 based on its income and socioeconomic status. And as you can see here, this gradient of colors represents that difference in household income. So we have a really varied and different grouping of income levels in Denver. And so we wanted to make sure we had a representative sample of all those different groups as well. Now onto our bee sampling. So we caught all of our bees with exactly what you'd imagine, like a butterfly net. We got a lot of strange looks and questions when we were in these parks, but we collected for about an hour during each visit. And then we froze and then preserved the bees, and they were all identified by our great research associate, Nathan Comey. The butterfly sampling was all done by me. It was collared walks, we call them, where you basically wander through an open area, you look side to side and then a certain distance in front of you. And I checked just visually what all the species were. And if I didn't know something, I would collect it and then identify it later. And finally, our floral sampling. So we would look at every single flower that was in a park or in these gardens we would go to, and I would identify the species. We would try and guess what the relative abundance was based on kind of the number of stems and how many flowers were in each stem. And then afterwards, we went back to the lab and we identified them as native or non-native based on USDA and CSU extension information. And then we identified them as cultivars or weedy. And weedy, we really just classified as something that is kind of bringing itself to a place. It's not being necessarily put in a park on purpose. And it's usually something, I think we exclusively identified things as weedy if they were non-native as well. So things that were invasive were also listed as weedy. And the final component that we measured here was that median income and land cover information. So all of this was done after the fact. We didn't do anything on the ground for the income and landscape factors. So we took a couple of parks, for example. This is the area where we surveyed from, represented by the black dot. And then in GIS, I made these buffers around them. And we are just focusing on that widest buffer for the purpose of this study. And that gave us, especially for median income, a much better representation of the actual income of the surrounding area than just using, for example, the census block that the park happens to be in. Because as you can see on this park in the bottom left, it's surrounded by several census blocks. And I think if you know anything about bugs, they don't really follow the limits of a park. They don't see any boundary for where your park ends. So we wanted to make sure we had a good radius around each park to get the land cover information as well. And on to our results. So kind of overall summary, we completed 75 surveys. We collected 3,199 bees from 143 species. And like Anna Gray said, we had 36 first-time records for Denver, which was super exciting. And we saw over 8,000 honeybees as well. We also saw 1,165 butterflies from 33 species, and we drove around 4,000 miles from Fort Collins to Denver every day. So it was a very exciting summer. And this is John Mullen, my advisor. He was not very good field tech that day. All right. And here's some summary information for any of you who are from Denver or have visited some of these parks. I thought this might be interesting. Um, these parks are listed in order of the highest species richness, which just means the number of species that were observed in that park. And for example, this is for bees. So at City Park, we had 47 species of bees that were represented in that one park. So we have City Park here was our top species richness, followed by Platt Farm open space, which is actually a low income park that's mostly made up of native grasses and really small perennials. So this was a really interesting result. And then Washington Park was third. So notably here, City Park and Washington Park both have huge pollinator gardens that are really well kept and managed, whereas Platt Farm is more kind of a natural area open space that's left with just whatever plants have been native to that area that have continued to grow there. So just something interesting to consider. And then with our butterflies, again, we have Washington Park is a huge supporter of butterflies. That garden is amazing. And then Houston Lake and Ruby Hill are actually in our lower income areas, but they just have really great open space and access to water, and butterflies have a little bit different requirements than bees. So I think that might be why they're more towards the top. All right, now we're going to get into a few graphs and figures, and I'll break this one down for you. There's a lot going on here, but really the most important thing is on our x-axis, we have our median household income. And then on our y-axis, we have three different measures of the abundance, species richness, and diversity. How are the bees doing? Are there a lot? Are there a lot of species? And then this is a diversity metric we use in ecology. And as you can see, there's not really any strong relationships happening here. Median household income is not direct impacting the bees in any way based on our study. So this is actually pretty encouraging. If there was a luxury effect, we would see a positive relationship where diversity, richness, and abundance would go up with income, but we're not seeing that. So that tells us that we likely don't have that direct luxury effect. Sorry, I'm gonna call. Okay, we're back. All right, and then on to our butterflies. So same thing here on our median household income on the x-axis. And then all the same y-axes, but now for butterflies. And here, again, we're not seeing any strong relationship, and we're especially not seeing a positive relationship. We do see a slight negative relationship even in graph F, but because there's a lot of what we call spread, we're not really sure this is conclusive that we have a strong relationship here where higher income would mean lower biodiversity. But this could have something to do with the fact that in higher income areas, we often saw a lot of those really manicured lawns with Kentucky bluegrass. And some butterflies really rely on native grasses for their young and to oviposit. So if they don't have those grasses, then they're not going to be as populous. Now on to our landscape factors. I focused in here on just two that are kind of indicative of our urbanization. So impervious surface cover and irrigated turf cover. And both of these are for bee species richness. Again, we're not really seeing a relationship here, which was surprising to me, but it also kind of makes sense because bees, they don't have a necessity to have like a special host plant. So irrigated turf may not bother them as much. And impervious surface, they're able to fly over those. So this wasn't extremely surprising. Butterflies, alternatively, we are seeing some relationships. So we have our impervious surface cover on the left. As that increases, we're seeing fewer butterfly species, telling us that as we have more impervious surface cover, or maybe as urbanization increases, it could be negatively impacting our butterflies. Whereas on the other side, this is kind of what we'd expect to see, more tree canopy cover, better butterfly species richness or higher butterfly species richness. This could be indicative that having a lot of tree canopy cover could just be a nicer habitat. It could mean other things to the landscape, but like I said, this is just one component that we're able to draw from. Now, finally, onto our local factors. So this is the stuff measured right in the field. So this is a pretty unsurprising graphic for us. On the bottom x-axis is our floral species richness, so the number of flower species. As that goes up, we're seeing more bee species. And this is pretty much what we'd expect. So this is a good sanity check for us that, yeah, if there's a lot of different species of flowers, then it's good for a lot of species of bees. But we also wanted to connect this a little bit further because we weren't seeing anything super satisfying with the income. We wanted to see if there were any other relationships there to unpack. And so here on the x-axis, we have median household income. So as that goes up, you're seeing a decrease in the abundance of weedy plants. And what this tells us is that in those high income parks, we're seeing fewer weedy plants and more natives and native cultivars. And interestingly, as we have higher weedy plant abundance also, we decrease our bee species richness. So having a lot of weedy plants, having a lot of non-natives is actually potentially detrimental to our bee communities. Not as many bees are able to survive off of those weedy plants. And then to draw back to our honeybee question, this is kind of our basic look at just if there are more honeybees, are there more species of native bees? We would expect if there's competition to have a downs here, more honeybees, less native bee species. But really, we're seeing no clear relationship here either, which tells us that probably we just need to do more research here, or maybe in areas that have a lot of flowers, they're able to support both honeybees and native bees, and that's why there's a high quantity of both. And finally, when we're looking at local factors, so that floral information for butterflies, the only really significant relationship we saw is that if there's a higher floral abundance, then there's higher butterfly species richness. But we didn't see any relationship between the weediness or native cultivar or anything like that with butterflies. They were a little bit less picky, a little bit more reliant on that land cover information. And finally, if there's any stats nerds in the virtual room, then we did a mixed effects model here where we were looking at bee species richness, and we basically dumped in all those factors that I explained to you all at the beginning to find out which model explained the most why we're seeing differences in bee species richness. And in every model we had, the most important factor was floral species richness. So this is really telling us that no matter what happened with the other local or landscape factors, floral speciesness, if it was going up, bee species richness was going up too. And then for butterflies, alternatively, we did the same methods. We put in all those different factors, but we found out that it's a little bit harder to explain butterfly species richness with the information we gathered. So we had a lot of factors that were contributing to it, notably some of these landscape factors like median income, impervious surface, and tree cover. Those were all really influential to explaining our butterfly species richness. And here's some fun facts for you all. As we're looking at the most common bee flower interactions, these were actually the three most common. And so as you can see, these are some weedy non-native species too, our white clover, our yellow sweet clover. And the reason that we think these were the most common interactions is just that they were available at every single park. And so even if it was a park that didn't have a lot of resources or a lot of management, if they didn't mow the lawn, then there could be bees because there was white clover. And then for our butterflies, most commonly we just saw butterflies flying over the lawn. They weren't often nectaring on anything, but again, they use those weedy non-native species. They like the white clover and they like the dandelion. So just don't mow your lawn and you can have some benefits for pollinators. Now going over kind of our final discussion, we learned through this study that income alone is not predictive of pollinator diversity. It's just one piece to the puzzle. But we did learn that affluent areas are supporting more native flower species or less of those non-native weedy species. We found that for our pollinators, bees and butterflies, floral species richness and abundance were huge, huge predictors of them having strong species richness and great diversity in their populations. And we also saw that weedy and non-native flowers were available at all of our parks, so they were commonly used. But if we're going to be able to support that high species richness for all of our pollinators, then we need to be able to plant natives as well to support that pollinator diversity. And a big part of that is park management. Like this is City Park, this is a great garden that they had. And that's really what's driving huge differences in our local factors, like our floral resources. And this also told us that regardless of income level, all of our parks can have good pollinator habitat. It doesn't necessarily have to have the most affluent community surrounding it, but there can be good habitat anywhere that you go. We also saw there was no direct competition between honeybees and native bees in this study, but kind of like if we think back to the urbanization graphic I showed y'all at the beginning, a lot of those species that might be living in cities could have already been competing with honeybees and could have been kind of narrowed down to who can survive at this point. So we're not sure if we'd see competition or how to measure it just yet, because we might already kind of have those winners and people and some individuals who already lost out in that battle. And finally, we saw that butterflies could be more sensitive to those urbanization land cover factors than bees. But a big piece is that we're missing any information on their host plants or if their host plants were available in the parks. So that's another piece that I would love to add if I were to repeat this study or add on to it. And finally, the big purpose of why we did this was to measure that baseline biodiversity, understand who we have in our Denver parks and in urban landscapes, and to inform management for Denver Parks and Rec. And in addition, something important to me was that we went to parks like Johnson Habitat, where there was a sign that said that park used to be a landfill, and now it's actually supporting tons of native pollinators and has beautiful habitat. So I think doing work like this also helps us gain a better understanding of how to increase equity and access to great biodiversity of pollinators and green spaces so that people and the pollinators can enjoy those spaces. So takeaways for you all: plant native flowers. I think a lot of you already know that. Try your best to avoid irrigated lawns and pesticides. And if you can, try to leave spots of bare ground and woody debris in your own green spaces so that they can nest and overwinter. Butterflies are important too. We focus a lot on the bees, but butterflies are great. So if you can plant their host plants, that's always beneficial. In Colorado, it's things like milkweeds, coneflowers, hackberry, and then a lot of native grasses. Try to be mindful and be careful. If you're going to have a hive, a honeybee hive in your backyard, it's great for education, but make sure that you have enough floral resources to be able to support them and just your native bees as well. And then finally, through this work, we really saw that despite the disparity of income surrounding these parks in Denver, every one of these parks had pollinators and has a lot of potential to support pollinators in the future. So visit your local parks, check out the pollinators, and then volunteer with DPR if you want a chance to make a difference with this management. Here's some resources we could probably share later just to get native seeds. I know it's expensive, so I wanted to just give some plugs to places that have free native swaps. And then I want to say thank you to my advisor, Dr. John Mola, my lab technicians. Thanks to Denver Parks and Rec and the Salazar Center for funding me. And thank you to PPA for having me today. This has been the best time. So that's my references. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Nikki. That was so insightful and interesting, and we've got a lot of questions. But before we get to those, we want to go ahead and pass it over to Denver Parks and Rec.
Thank you, Nikki, and your whole lab and Dr. Mola. This research is amazing, and we so appreciate it. So quick next steps of what DPR is doing with this research and our other work. So first of all, DPR is committed to restoring and protecting healthy pollinator habitats and ecosystems. That's something we are committed to doing more of. Brandon, you're running my slides, so next slide. So a little bit of that relevant context. I think most people on this call are probably familiar with the state legislation that's been happening, but I want to point out Denver Parks and Recreation last year in 2023, we adopted an internal policy, which we call our turf grass policy. So we're taking the lead really from the city's perspective of taking a stand against non-functional turf and the way we design and plan our parks going forward. We will not be using bluegrass turf as the default ground cover that has been used kind of historically. Over the past decade, we've been changing how we design parks and open spaces. So you'll see kind of the newer parks in the Northfield area, Central Park Community, Green Valley Ranch. Some of those parks are more designed with a balance of native and functional recreational turf areas. And then we also, so this past year with our sister agency, Community Planning and Development, we did a citywide look at a desktop analysis of where is turf grass in the city. So looking not only at our parks and public spaces, but across private spaces as well. So hopefully helping inform policy going forward in community planning and development and creating this internal vision statement for the city of what we want our resilient landscape to look like. So more to come on that, our sister agency and CPD. Next slide, please. And then another data point that we've been working on since 2016, we started piloting what we call the landscape typology, which is a system of mapping and documenting our different landscape types across the city. So we have our native landscape spectrum of upland herbaceous and upland forested, our riparian systems, our wetland systems, and then what we call traditional park spaces. So our bluegrass lawn and our bluegrass forested. So we now have GIS data that documents the entire park system of what that classification system looks like. And each polygon in our parks received a score based on a number of different factors. Next slide, please. And we just updated kind of what we call our final phase of all of our parks are now encapsulated in this data. So these bubble diagrams show that breakdown of relationship of each type comparatively across the city. And we're super excited that this diagram shows upland herbaceous is that #1 most acres of our park system. So at 35% of our park landscapes are that upland herbaceous native. This document will be published a little bit later this fall. We're just polishing up that final addendum to our landscape typology manual. Next slide, Brandon. And then one of the really exciting things we did with this last update is to actually incorporate a pollinator habitat score in that overall landscape topology scoring rubric. So actually, with these quick on-site assessments, the ecology team will give it this rating of poor, fair, good, and excellent. So we can help track, the use of this data with that rapid assessment of our park spaces over time. So we can hopefully see how we increase our park native landscapes and resources, hopefully with some follow-up studies for similar research to what Nicki and her lab team have been doing to see that improvement over time. And then one more slide I think I have before I'll hand it over to Brandon. So a couple more next steps. We just received a civic grant from the National Science Foundation with the Salazar Center for North American Conservation to continue this next steps of what the research will be. So that's a planning level grant we'll work on starting in October. So more to come on that. The Salazar Center will put out a press release about that in probably October. Our team is continuing to incorporate landscape transformations, so removing our bluegrass turf and adding in these native landscapes. Many of those projects are on our capital improvement list over the next 5 years, so more on that to come. We'll start to look at ways that the survey portion of the results of this research can help inform our outreach and public education to our communities to help improve that public perception of these native landscapes. And then I'll turn it over to Brandon to talk about our citywide habitat study that is kicking off later today, actually.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Brandon Herman, Senior Urban Ecology Planner with Denver Parks. And to keep this kind of like native pollinators and parks thread going, I'm going to discuss a project, as Jessica mentioned, that will be kicking off later this afternoon. It's an urban habitat connectivity study. So the kind of basic impetus for our study, and this is definitely a bona fide soapbox speech, urbanization is the second biggest driver of habitat loss here in Colorado. We know that pollinator numbers, generally speaking, decline with increasing urbanization. Another factor that often gets overlooked is night pollution has some pretty profound negative impacts on local wildlife. And there are nuances to this. So there's some research that came out about 4 years ago called the biological desert fallacy, and it showed that cities can, in fact, effectively support native species. It's important to note that there are caveats to everything. For example, recent studies have shown that suburban development actually held a higher pollinating insect species richness than previous agriculture monocultures. So it just kind of depends, and that's why it's so important to have the kind of studies that Nicki and the CSU folks have been conducting, so we can have some semblance of a baseline when we try to make decisions. So I'm just going to kind of read this. This is the reason for doing this research and what we're hoping it does, or the reason for doing the study. So habitat quality analysis is the basis for conservation management, habitat restoration decisions. It's a super useful tool to help provide a snapshot for where high quality and low quality wildlife habitat might lie, and its potential distribution and those gaps. And then the connectivity analysis incorporates information for specific species, their habitat, dispersal ability, barriers, things of that nature. So to break the kind of the two pieces down, the habitat quality is the contribution of resources that basically guide the survival and reproduction of individuals and persistence of populations as a whole. So we'll be using some habitat indicators from the CSU research to help inform and define habitat within our modeling exercise. A good example of this is the platform open space, which Nicki mentioned earlier. High diversity of native grasses, but didn't have a lot of floral nectar pollen resources for the bees. And in speaking with John Mola, who was Nicki's advisor, he thinks potentially it's because those native prairie landscapes provide a lot of nesting resources, so ground nesting and cavity nesting resources. So again, it's all very nuanced. And then the habitat connectivity component is the degree, high or low, that organisms can move across the landscape. And we're thinking of this within the urban context. We're also using some more data that was given to us by Dr. John Mola. So we're thinking of, for example, large-bodied bees generally have a range of about 800 meters, and then smaller bees around 250. So we're going to use these two distances to help tune what habitat connectivity might mean for our native bee species within the context of kind of the urban confinement. And this is just a good example of what we're talking about when we talk about habitat connectivity. So if you imagine the yellow kind of greenish background as being urbanization, so houses, parking lots, roads, and then the thicker kind of shrubby, patchy portions as our parks and open space, maybe even large residential yards, we would consider image A left as having higher connectivity than image B, meaning that it's easier for wildlife to travel between these parks and open space patches. So we can identify where there are strong connections within our city and between those habitat patches. In addition, identify where improvements can be made to help strengthen the overall connection. And so, so what? What's the point of doing all this? Well, we're hoping that the final outputs of this analysis will help us prioritize restoration efforts. So are there areas that are doing a good job of supporting wildlife and helping them connect to the city? Let's invest in funding to make sure that we're keeping up with restoration so that weedy species and disturbances don't take over. Conservation to better coordinate with our sister departments on citywide projects and policies and plans. And then finally, acquisition. How can we use this kind of decision-making tool as another layer in the stack for those multi-benefits when we're prioritizing new parks and open space acquisitions? And that's me. Thanks so much. I will take us out of this.
Great. Thank you so much to Nikki and CSU and to Jessica and Brandon from DPR. We really appreciate you guys being here. This was so interesting. Gonna go ahead and jump into some questions. We got about 8 minutes left here. So one person says they lead a lot of invasive plant removals, and they're curious if they need to be considering the potentially negative impact on pollinators by removing those invasive or non-natives.
I think one thing that we realized over this work was that having things like clovers especially and non-natives like dandelion, those are usually things that will pop up and aren't particularly aggressive as invasives. We're not always removing them in large numbers. Something like a sweet clover, maybe that's all right to take away. But I think generally for ground cover plants, especially things that are in the legume family, those are actually really nutritious for bumblebees especially. So leaving your white clover, I would really recommend anything that would grow in your Kentucky bluegrass if you don't have an option, but to have that as well, I think you're fine. But for the most part, non-native plants, they're not going to support the same native biodiversity that natives can, just because they haven't evolved together. They're not going to be as kind of codependent in that way. They won't support them quite as well. So leave your clovers, but I think other things that are a bit more aggressive are totally.
Great, thanks. And then we also just had a few clarifying questions about the study. So there are disparities in parks, but you were saying that a lot of parks, regardless of area income, are typically just grassy. Okay, that's a yes. And then, yes.
Yeah, that was generally the case.
Okay, cool. And then another one was kind of what's the difference between fewer species richness and reduced proportion of ground cover?
Yeah. So species richness, like if we're talking about flowers, for example, we're measuring individual flower species. So if you have like a monarda, a coneflower, and a sunflower, then your species richness is 3. And if you have one fewer, your species richness is 2. When we're looking at the ground cover information, we were just going based on an area cover. We weren't doing an individual like species differentiation there. So if we're talking about like turf cover, then that was something given to us by GIS and it's an overall area. So we don't have any information on if there are different grasses there. For the most part, that would only be labeled if it was Kentucky bluegrass or some kind of irrigated turf. But that's an area-based measurement. We don't have any on the ground species sampling there.
Got it. Thank you. And then the final kind of clarifying question, are parks typically bigger in size in higher income areas? Is there any sort of relation to size and income?
That's a good question. I would say generally no. Some parks, our biggest park was First Creek at Denver, and that was in a lower income area by the airport, and that was a huge park. Size wasn't really something that we considered because at most of our parks, there was only floral resources in one small area of the park. And so we basically only focused on those spots and then would return to those spots. So that was kind of how we got around it. But I think for the most part, they were all fairly similar size. There was some variation, but there wasn't any relationship between park size and income that we saw or that we thought would be important to the study because we were always just going to where the flowers were, and that was always very condensed.
Got it. Thank you. The next question is kind of just in a practical sense for someone's yard. Would it be better to have just a few plant species, native plant species, with lots of those types of species, or would it be better to have lots of different type of species diversity, but fewer of each of those plants, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think generally going for high diversity, one nice thing is that you can have different flowers that bloom at different times of the season. If you have just a couple of species, they might all bloom at the same time. And then early season bee species might be really lucky, but then towards the end of the season, when you have a lot of bumblebees come out, then they might not have anything left to eat. So I definitely recommend having a lot of diversity just to stagger that flowering time, because bees, kind of like birds or butterflies, they'll emerge at different times and have different flight periods. So it's good to have something for everybody all through the season.
Great, thank you. Our next question is about perennials versus annuals. So it seems like a lot of people are prioritizing perennials, but does that deprive pollinators of floral species to an extent where we should be considering a more balanced approach with perennials versus annuals?
Think I did more work with this during my undergraduate work, but to my knowledge, I think perennials are usually a little bit more nutrient rich. A lot of the annuals that we have or that are available to be sold might bloom and then not have as many of those nectar and pollen resources for bees. Um, so perennials, in my experience, are generally more successful, but like I said before, I think it's important to just have something available all the time too. So I don't know if Brandon or Jessica have any more gardening knowledge than mine too. I'm more of an observational scientist, but that's my knowledge on it.
Yeah, I think I had the same opinion and the same experience having, like, I like to think about perennials as your baseline and making sure that there you can count on something coming up year after year, and using annuals if you want to help fill out some of those gaps in the temporal scale, so that you have the most number of the highest number of floral resources available over the longest period of time, is a good goal to think about.
Great, thank you all. Our next question is, has Denver undertaken a survey of honeybee hives in the city? And do you know how many hives are active?
Not that I know of. I don't think anyone is tracking that.
All right.
It's worth noting that we and Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, we do not allow honeybee hives in our parks, right?
Correct. Yeah.
For all the reasons Nicki explained. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. And then Nicki, this is a question for you. If you're familiar with Asia Kaiser's study in Boulder that found less bee diversity in higher income neighborhoods, and just your thoughts on that.
I did. Yeah, that got sent to me really broadly. It was super exciting to have kind of people working on similar stuff so close by. I think something really interesting about Asia's study is that she was able to do something a little bit more experimental by focusing on a single crop plant. So she was able to kind of study pollination success in different areas. It was a little bit more experimental and like directed towards seeing if there was higher pollination success of a specific ag plant in those different income areas. We didn't have the opportunity to go beyond our parks. I know someone said in the comments too, they mentioned it would be great to do this in people's lawns or kind of outside of the parks too. And I was like, oh, I wish like that would have been great. Just a little bit more permitting and difficult to get in people's private property. So this was kind of um, our best gauge. But I think it's super unsurprising. I think Asia's found that, and in Boulder, I think we also see there's a lot of green space in Boulder, and it's a smaller, more condensed city than Denver. So I think that's one area that's a little bit different too, where we were kind of surprised not to see a luxury effect, but because Denver is so sprawling, it's also difficult to really categorize it or have. Um, I guess we would have to survey like maybe 10 times as many sites, I think, to be able to get a good idea or maybe see that similar effect. So I thought her study was super interesting, though. I would love to hear more from her on that too, because it's definitely difficult work trying to categorize a big city into an ecological study site.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. I do want to be mindful of the time. It's 1:01. We have, excuse me, about 3 more questions left if you all have time. If not, I can email them to you and pass them along. But how are we feeling on time? Okay, great. So the next question is, you mentioned that bees and other insects overwinter in the stems of plants. Is this just native plants that they stem in? And then what plants are most important for this purpose? For instance, this person has a lot of larkspur. Would that be good to use for overwintering?
That's a really good question. No, it's not specific to native plants. If you've seen like bee hotels before too, people will even just drill holes in wood or put in like little paper straws so that they're able to nest in there. So it's not specific even to plants. They're pretty crafty, especially in cities, to be able to use some kind of cavity. As far as plant recommendations go, I think somebody just added one in the chat. I can't say I'm not a gardener, so we're at like the nexus of my knowledge of where we move into recommending that. So I would stick to what people say in the comments, but what I do is I have those like cavity nests that you are made out of wood and they'll be able to nest in there. So like I said, they're pretty crafty and pretty rugged, and so they'll be able to use those paper straws too. If you're not able to leave stalks in your yard, or if you're not able to have plants in your yard as well.
I even have, this is just anecdotal evidence, but I even have, I've seen cavity nesting bees in the tiny spaces in the texture of the brick on my house. So, I mean, yeah, they'll use just about anything they can, anecdotally.
Great, thank you. Our next question is just in Denver parks, is there any data on moths or other nocturnal pollinators? Okay, looking like a no.
You guys are shaking your head, so I think no.
This was really the first research study we have of anything in Denver parks. So if Nicki and John and their team didn't study it, we don't have it.
Got it, thank you. And then our final question for today is kind of just about the income in relation to city managed parks, and just kind of clarifying, are the parks independent of income because they're money from the city, or kind of exactly how does that play a role?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's kind of both a limitation and a benefit of this study using the parks, is that obviously you pay taxes to the city and those taxes go toward management. And so there is a certain assumption that by using that 1 kilometer buffer of income and land cover surrounding each park, we're assuming that park is maybe better managed because it might have higher income residents surrounding it. But really the motivation for it was based on other studies that were based on other insects that we're trapping, or based on mammals, which aren't really found specifically in parks. So they were using camera traps or other trap methods to be able to see them across cities. And those areas, you're always just seeing something in a green space for the most part. So for us, City Park was kind of the best avenue to be able to have those encounters and be able to catch pollinators and be able to see them in cities without being in somebody's lawn, because they have to be where flowers are for the most part. So for us, we're not able to put a camera trap and see if there are bees or butterflies that pass by it on a street corner in an area that has a known income. So for us, this was kind of our best proxy by using just like the best floral resources in an area that might be near a high income area. And we kind of tried to include those landscape factors to be able to add on how that neighborhood income might be influencing. But I think like my dream would have been that we could also add people's lawns or get citizen science data or some other external source to be able to understand maybe directly how income could be impacting. But to my knowledge, there's no known data that we could have that directly says, oh, if my taxes are this high for my property, then it goes this much to my park. That's just not available to us. So this was kind of our best assumption based on what was already out in the literature, and then what we were able to actually do to be able to catch the insects.
Great. Well, those are all of our questions. I just want to thank Nicki, Jessica, and Brandon again. We really appreciate you having or joining us. I think we all learned a lot. And thank you to everyone who joined and listened and asked questions. We appreciate all of you. And yeah, thank you all so much. We'll see you next time. And I'll be sure to send out a link of the recording and the follow-up. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks, Anna Gray.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.